Florida, August 1976. A man fishing spots a metal barrel drifting in the warm, hazy water near Miami. He thinks it's just garbage until he notices the chains wrapped around it. When the police pull the barrel to shore and force it open, the smell is the first thing that hits them. Inside are the remains of a man. His legs had been cut off so he could fit inside. 10 days earlier, that man was alive, having lunch at a private club, laughing with friends, and making plans for his future. His name was John Hanson, also known as Johnny Roselli. He was a Hollywood insider, a diplomat for the mob, a helper for the CIA, and a man that some people believe knew the truth about the murder of President John F. Kennedy. He was a gangster who went to parties with movie stars, helped the mob control movies, and worked with the CIA to try and kill Fidel Castro. And now he was found floating in a barrel off the coast of Florida. This is the story of Johnny Roselli, the mobster who knew too much. Before we jump into this amazing true story, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. What time is it for you right now? And if you enjoy deep stories about gangsters that help you relax, please hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell. Trust me, you will not want to miss what comes next. Also, give this video a thumbs up. Now, get comfortable, because what you are about to hear is one of the most interesting mob stories ever told. It is a tale that covers 50 years and involves some of the biggest secrets of the 20th century. So, let's go back to where it all started. Back to a small village in the countryside of Italy, where a boy named Filippo Sacco took his first breath on America's birthday. July 4th, 1905, Esperia, Italy, 1905. Imagine a village located in the Lazio region, southeast of Rome. Old stone buildings are crowded together on hillsides that have watched empires rise and fall over many centuries. The land there is tough and not easy to farm. Families work the soil from sunrise to sunset, trying to grow olives and grapes from earth that does not give in easily. For many generations, the Sacco family had lived this way. They were farmers and workers who understood one simple truth, that staying alive meant working until your back hurt and your hands bled. On July 4th, 1905, which was American Independence Day, even though that date meant nothing in this faraway Italian village, Maria Antonia Pasquale Sacco gave birth to a son. They named him Filippo. His father, Vincenzo Sacco, looked at his baby boy and saw both hope and a very hard reality. There was no future for them here, not for his children, not in this place where being poor stuck to families like the dust from the fields. Vincenzo made a choice that would change his family's history forever. He would go to America first. He would find work, save up money, and then send for his wife and children. This was a story that many people knew, one told by millions of Italian immigrants during those years. The idea of America sparkled like fake gold to families who had no hope. But unlike fake gold, sometimes that promise turned out to be real. For the next 6 years, young Filippo only knew his father through letters and the money that would sometimes show up from across the ocean. He grew up being cared for by his mother, helping with whatever small jobs a little boy could manage, learning how life worked in the village, even while he listened to stories about a magical place called America. People said the streets there were covered with gold and any man could become rich. In 1911, when Filippo was 6 years old, the family finally got the news they had been hoping for. Vincenzo had saved up enough money. He had made a life for himself in Boston, Massachusetts, where many Italian immigrants had settled in a neighborhood called East Boston. It was time for Maria Antonia and the children to go and join him. The trip across the ocean was a terrible experience that Filippo would never want to talk about later in life. They were packed into the lowest part of the ship with hundreds of other immigrants. The smell of unwashed bodies and vomit mixed with the salty sea air. The ship rolled and shook constantly. For a 6-year-old boy who had only ever lived in a village far from the ocean, it must have been more frightening than words can describe. But then, after many weeks at sea, the Statue of Liberty appeared through the morning fog, and a completely new world opened up in front of him. East Boston in the 1910s was very different from the countryside of Italy, but in some ways it was strangely similar. The poverty was just as difficult to bear, the work just as hard, but here, at least there was some hope. There was a chance for something better, and there was also a hidden economy, a world operating just under the surface of regular society. In this world, men who had the right mix of desire to succeed, a willingness to be cruel, and cleverness learned on the streets, could fight their way to power and money. Vincenzo Sacco found whatever work he could, doing the same backbreaking jobs that most Italian immigrants had to do. The family settled into a small apartment in the close Italian community of East Boston. In this neighborhood, different Italian dialects mixed with broken English, and the smell of Sunday gravy cooking could be smelled in every building. For young Filippo, now called by his American name Philip, the change was hard. He did not speak any English. The other kids made fun of his Italian clothes and his strong accent. The children who were born in America acted like they were better than the newcomers. It was during these early years that Philip learned his first important lesson about how to survive in America. Fit in, or you will be destroyed. He went to school sometimes, but his learning was often interrupted because he had to work and help bring in money for his family. By the time he was 12, he was running small errands and doing odd jobs. He was learning the streets of East Boston as well as he had once known the fields of Hesperia. And it was on these streets that he met the men who would shape his future. They stood on street corners wearing expensive suits, and they seemed to be safe from the hard times that hurt everyone else. They had money when others had nothing. They got respect. Really, it was fear. From the toughest men in the area, they were the local gangsters. They were the men who had figured out how to cheat the system and take what America promised but almost never gave. Philip watched them. He paid attention to how they moved and how they talked, and how other men showed them respect. He noticed which stores they went into and came out of with envelopes full of cash. He saw the police officers who pretended not to see what was happening. He studied the way things were organized, the rules that were never spoken, and the signs of who had power and who was weak. In 1918, something terrible happened to the Sacco family. Vincenzo died. The exact details are not known now, but the result was devastating. Philip was 13 years old. Suddenly, he was the man of the family, responsible for his mother and his brothers and sisters. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, and there were almost no legal jobs that could support a family for a teenage Italian immigrant who had not gone to school much. Philip turned to the streets. He started running numbers for gambling. He delivered packages that he knew better than to open. He became a familiar person in the group of small-time criminals who controlled the illegal activities in the neighborhood. He was quick, smart, and he knew how to keep his mouth shut. These three qualities made him useful. By the time he was 16, Philip Sacco had learned how to fight using his fists, his feet, and anything he could grab nearby. The streets of East Boston were like battlefields where Irish, Italian, and Jewish gangs fought for control of territory and to earn respect. Philip did okay for himself. and he started to get a reputation as someone you should not mess with. Even though he was not very big, but he was also learning something even more important. He learned that using your brain was better than using your muscles. The men who lasted and built real power were not the toughest fighters. They were the smartest operators. In September 1922, Philip's careful education on the streets came to a sudden stop. He was arrested for stealing a car in Boston. The exact details are not clear. Was he just out for a joyride? Was he helping a local gang take cars apart to sell the parts? Or was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? What we know for sure is that getting arrested scared him badly. At only 17 years old, he was facing the real possibility of going to prison. The American dream he had been chasing since he got off the boat was suddenly about to be taken away from him. Philip Sacco made a choice that would decide the rest of his life. He ran. First, he went to New York. That huge city where a young man could disappear into the crowds and the noise. He spent 3 months there, staying in cheap hotels, doing odd jobs using fake names, and always looking over his shoulder for police who might recognize him. But New York was too dangerous. The car theft charge was serious enough that the authorities would keep looking for him. So Philip kept moving. He went west to Chicago. He was drawn there by stories of opportunities in the city that was becoming the main place for gangsters in America. More importantly, Chicago was far enough away from Boston that a young man could completely change who he was. Somewhere during this trip, maybe on the train heading west, maybe in a dirty hotel room in Chicago, Philip Sacco stopped existing in his place. A new person appeared, John Roselli. The story of how he chose this name has become a legend, and like many legends, the truth is probably simpler than the story people tell. Some people say he saw the name Roselli written on Italian paintings, and he liked how it sounded artistic and sophisticated. Others think it was just a common Italian last name that sounded real, no matter where it came from. The change was complete. John Roselli was born, and Philip Sacco was buried and gone forever. But later, the FBI would find out something very interesting. The birth certificate for John Roselli that was filed in Chicago was fake, and it had been created many years after the supposed birth date. When federal agents finally started looking into this, they could not find any proof that anyone named John Roselli had ever been born in Chicago. The man had wiped out his past so completely that even after years of investigation, the FBI could not say for sure who he really was. They had suspicions, they made guesses, and they followed clues back to East Boston and the Sacco family, but they could never find solid proof of his true identity. This ability to hide the truth, to create believable lies, and to live in a kind of fog where his history was not fully recorded would become one of Roselli's greatest skills. In the criminal world, where men often needed to disappear or become someone new, this talent was extremely valuable. Chicago in the early 1920s was going through a huge change. The 18th Amendment, which made it illegal to make, sell, or transport alcohol, had started in 1920, almost overnight. Millions of Americans who liked to drink became criminals. And when there is illegal demand, criminal empires grow to meet it. Roselli arrived in Chicago just as Prohibition was becoming big. The city was like a war zone. Irish gangs, Jewish groups, and Italian organizations fought each other for control of the very profitable business of selling illegal alcohol. People driving trucks full of beer raced through the streets in cars with armor on them. Bars that were hidden behind ordinary storefronts did a huge amount of business. Hijackings, murders, and bombings happened every day. Into all this chaos stepped the young man now calling himself John Roselli. He needed money. He needed protection. He needed a new identity that would hold up if anyone checked into it. Most of all, he needed to connect himself with an organization that was powerful enough to succeed in this dangerous new world. He started small, of course, everyone did. Roselli found work with low-level bootleggers, helping to move illegal alcohol from hidden breweries to bars and private clubs. The work was dangerous and did not pay much, but it got him into the business. He drove trucks. He kept watch for police. And sometimes he got into fights when there were arguments about deliveries. He was learning the business starting from the bottom. But Roselli was always watching and always thinking. He studied the criminal world of Chicago, the way a scholar studies old books. He noticed which groups were becoming more powerful and which ones were weak. He identified the young men who were moving up, the ones who were building something that would last. And one name kept coming up, spoken with a mix of fear and respect. Al Capone, Alphonse Gabriel Capone, the son of Italian immigrants from Brooklyn, had arrived in Chicago in 1919 at the invitation of a gangster named Johnny Torrio. By the middle of the 1920s, after Torrio retired following an attempt to kill him, Capone had taken control of what would become known as the Chicago Outfit. He was building an empire that spread across the city and beyond. He controlled selling illegal alcohol, gambling, prostitution, and corrupting politicians. And he did it all with brutal efficiency. In 1927, fate and careful planning came together for Johnny Roselli. In September of that year, the boxing world was focused on Chicago. Jack Dempsey, the former heavyweight champion, was fighting Gene Tunney in a rematch that would later become famous as the Long Count Fight. The fight was held at Soldier Field, and it seemed like everyone who was important in Chicago wanted to be there. Roselli managed to get a ticket, though how he got it is not known. But getting into the fight was not his real goal. The real chance came after the fight, at a party being thrown at the Metropole Hotel, which was Capone's main place of business in downtown Chicago. Try to imagine the scene. The grand ballroom of the Metropole was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of expensive whiskey. Men in sharp suits stood around talking, their voices a low noise underneath the jazz band playing in the corner. And right in the middle of it all, holding court like a king in his castle, sat Al Capone. His face was scarred, but his expensive suit was perfect. He had a cigar in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other. Roselli, young and eager to succeed, somehow managed to get close enough to exchange a few words with Capone. It was not much, just a quick introduction, a handshake, maybe a joke that made the famous gangster smile. But it was enough. It was a start. The real connection came later, through persistence and relationships he had carefully built. Roselli set up another meeting with Capone at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. This time, they talked more seriously. Capone was always looking for capable men to help his empire grow. And he saw something in Roselli: intelligence, ambition, and that special quality that marked a man as someone you could trust in a world where trust could get you killed. In 1928, Al Capone made an offer that would change Roselli's life forever. He wanted Roselli to work for him, to represent the interests of the Chicago outfit on the West Coast. Specifically, he wanted Roselli to go to Los Angeles. Los Angeles in 1928 was still more of a possibility than a finished place. The movie industry was growing, but it was not yet the giant it would become. The city spread out across the Southern California landscape, connected by newly built roads and trolley lines. The weather was perfect. The chances for success seemed unlimited, and the local authorities, with the right kind of persuasion, were very willing to work with businessmen who operated outside the law. Roselli arrived in Los Angeles with Capone's approval and a simple mission. He was to establish and maintain Chicago's influence over the bootlegging operations on the West Coast, and he was to create a good relationship with the Mafia family in Los Angeles. At that time, the Los Angeles branch of La Cosa Nostra was led by Joseph Ardisone, with Jack Jogna as his second in command. These men controlled most of the Italian criminal activity in Southern California, and Capone wanted to be friends with them, not fight them. Roselli fit smoothly into this world. He was charming, he was sophisticated, and most importantly, he had the support of the most powerful mob boss in America. The Los Angeles family welcomed him because they could see the benefits of working with the Chicago outfit. Together, they would be stronger. They could split up territories, share information, and show a united front against their competitors. Roselli settled into life in Los Angeles with excitement. He rented an apartment in a nice part of town. He bought expensive suits. He developed a personal style that would earn him the nickname Handsome Johnny. He was always dressed perfectly. His hair was always neat, and his manners were refined. To someone who did not know him, he might have seemed like a successful businessman or someone who worked in the movie industry. No one would have guessed he was a mob enforcer from Chicago. His first major job in California involved the gambling ships that operated offshore in international waters. Beyond the reach of local police, these floating casinos made a huge amount of money. They attracted wealthy people from Los Angeles who wanted to gamble without the shame and legal problems of going to illegal gambling places on land. The most famous of these ships was the SS Monfalcone. Named after a town in northeastern Italy, it was a beautiful boat that anchored 3 miles offshore, technically in international waters, and it ran gambling games all day and night. The owners were making a fortune, and Roselli, with the support of the Chicago outfit and the Los Angeles family, decided that this fortune should be shared. Taking over the ship was a classic mob strategy. First, they applied subtle pressure. They delivered messages. They gave warnings when that did not work. The pressure got stronger. Accidents happened to crew members. It became hard for the ship to get supplies. Finally, when the owners still resisted, they took more direct action. The exact details are not known now, but the result was clear. The Monfalcone came under mob control, and Roselli personally managed its operations. This success made Roselli's reputation in Los Angeles. He was no longer just Chicago's representative. He now had power of his own. Money came in from the gambling ship and from other illegal activities like bookmaking, selling illegal alcohol, lending money at very high interest, and protection schemes. Roselli was becoming rich. And even more importantly, he was building relationships that would help him for many years. But success also brought problems. Roselli's health, which was never very strong, started to get worse. He got tuberculosis, a disease of the lungs that had killed millions of people before antibiotics were available. The sickness attacked his lungs, leaving him weak and coughing up blood. For months, he disappeared from public view. He went to sanitariums and places where people recovered from illness. Fighting to stay alive, tuberculosis was a death sentence for many people in those days. But Roselli survived. The long periods of recovery gave him time to think, to make plans, and to imagine what his future could be. He was not satisfied with just being a successful gangster. He wanted more. He wanted to be seen as a legitimate person. He wanted to move in the highest social circles, not as a criminal who was tolerated, but as a respected figure. And as the 1930s began, Roselli started to see a way forward, one that led to the bright lights of Hollywood. By 1930, Hollywood was changing from a group of small independent studios into a real industry. It was making movies at a faster rate than ever before. The change from silent films to movies with sound had completely changed the business. It created new stars overnight and destroyed the careers of others just as quickly. Millions of Americans, desperate for escape during the Great Depression, went to movie theaters to watch their troubles disappear for 90 minutes at a time. Behind the glamorous surface of movie stars and fancy parties, Hollywood ran on the same principles as any other business. It was about workers, money, and power. The major studios, MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, RKO, Columbia, Universal, and United Artists, controlled every part of making and showing movies. They owned the theaters where their movies played. They kept actors, directors, and writers under long contracts that gave the studios complete control over their careers. It was a system where one company controlled everything, and it made an enormous amount of money. But this golden machine had one major weakness. Its workers, thousands of people, kept the studios running. They were electricians, carpenters, painters, projectionists, drivers, and security guards. If those workers went on strike, making movies would stop, and if making movies stopped, the studios lost money at a terrible rate. The mob had figured this out before the studio bosses did. Johnny Roselli saw this opportunity earlier than most people. He had been building relationships with people in Hollywood since he arrived in Los Angeles. At first, these connections came through his regular criminal activities. He provided protection. He set up gambling that was off the books. And he supplied illegal alcohol to parties for movie people. But he was also studying the movie business. He was learning how it worked and understanding where it was vulnerable. His big chance came through a union called the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, or IATSE. This was the union that represented most of the workers in Hollywood. IATSE was powerful, but like many unions in those days, it was also corrupt and could be influenced by outsiders. The Chicago outfit was always looking for new ways to make money, and they saw IATSE as a perfect target to take over and control. The person who came up with the mob's plan for Hollywood was Frank Nitti. He had taken over the Chicago outfit after Capone was sent to prison for not paying his taxes in 1931. Even though people often think of Nitti as just a violent enforcer, he was actually a very smart criminal planner. He understood that the best crimes were the ones where the victims could not report you because they were also guilty of something. Threatening to shut down movie production with a strike was exactly that kind of crime. Nitti's main men for the Hollywood operation were George Brown and Willie Bioff. Brown was the president of an IATSE local in Chicago, while Bioff was a criminal, a pimp, and someone who corrupted unions. He had a talent for making people afraid. Together, they would be the public faces of the operation. While Roselli provided the muscle and coordination on the West Coast, the plan was simple but brutal. First, they would take control of IATSE by getting Brown elected as the international president. Then, they would use the threat of a damaging strike to force the studios to pay them money. Pay up, or your movie production stops. For studios spending thousands of dollars every day on making a movie, paying the mob became just another cost of doing business. Roselli's part was very important. He was the link between the Chicago outfit and the studio bosses. He was the sophisticated person who could meet with studio executives in their offices, speak their language, and make the threats sound almost reasonable. He developed especially close relationships with several important people in Hollywood, most notably Harry Cohn, the feared president of Columbia Pictures. Harry Cohn was a difficult person, even by Hollywood standards. He was rude, he had a bad temper, and he could be cruel. He ran Columbia Pictures with total control. He had a bad habit of bothering actresses, and he was famous for screaming fits that could be heard all over the movie studio. But he was also a very smart businessman who understood power and respected men who used it effectively. Roselli and Cohn became genuine friends, or as close to friends as two men in their positions could be. They played golf together. They went to the same parties. They both appreciated beautiful women and expensive things. More importantly, they helped each other. Cohn's connection to Roselli became so valuable that when Columbia needed money in the 1930s, it was Roselli who introduced him to a financier with mob connections named Abner "Longy" Zwillman. Zwillman, who was partners with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky in the New York underworld, loaned Cohn the money he needed to buy out his partner and take complete control of Columbia Pictures. In return, Zwillman got a secret share in the studio, one that would make money for years. This friendship helped Roselli in many ways. Through Cohn, he gained access to the most important people in Hollywood. He went to movie premieres and fancy parties. He met movie stars, both men and women, and importantly, he learned how the movie industry really worked. Knowledge that made him even more valuable to the Chicago outfit's extortion scheme. But Roselli was not happy just being the mob's representative in Hollywood. He wanted to be part of the movie business himself. He started getting involved in the process of making movies. He offered suggestions, he read scripts, and he even suggested ideas for stories. Some executives were nice to him because they were afraid of him. Others, like Cohn, genuinely valued his ideas. Roselli had a natural sense for what audiences wanted, and he understood how stories worked. Meanwhile, the extortion operation was becoming huge. George Brown had been successfully made the international president of IATSE, which gave the mob control over the union. Willie Bioff, working as Brown's enforcer, would approach studio bosses with a simple offer: pay us, or we will call strikes that will shut down your movie productions. The amounts they asked for started out fairly small. $50,000 here, $75,000 there. But as the operation proved successful, their demands got bigger. Major studios were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to keep labor peace. When you adjust for inflation, the Chicago outfit was taking millions of dollars from Hollywood, and a lot of that money was passing through Roselli's hands. The studios paid because they had no choice. If they did not pay, a strike would shut down production, and that would cost them much more money. They also paid because many of them were involved in other dishonest activities themselves. Hollywood in the 1930s was not exactly honest. Creative accounting, not paying all their taxes, and various other kinds of cheating were normal ways of doing business. The studio bosses could not go to the police about the mob's extortion without risking exposure of their own crimes. Roselli lived a life of luxury during this time. He kept a nice apartment. He drove expensive cars. He wore suits from the best tailors. He went out with beautiful actresses, and he developed a reputation as a charming date and a generous lover. One of the women he had a relationship with was Jean Harlow. She was a blonde movie star who was one of the most famous actresses of that time. Harlow had become a huge star overnight in Howard Hughes's 1930 movie Hell's Angels. By the time she met Roselli in the mid-1930s, she was at the height of her fame. but her personal life was a mess. She had been through 2 failed marriages, and she was involved in a scandal when her second husband, a producer named Paul Byrne, died under mysterious circumstances. Roselli and Harlow's relationship was short but intense. He gave her protection and friendship during a difficult time in her life. She gave him access to the very highest levels of Hollywood society, and she made his reputation as a man who could attract the most desirable women in America even stronger. When Harlow died suddenly in 1937 at the age of 26 from kidney failure, Roselli was very upset. It was one of the few times in his life when his usual calm and sophisticated manner disappeared, and you could see real emotion underneath. But the good times for the Hollywood extortion scheme were numbered. The mob had been too successful and too greedy. They had taken too much money, and some studio executives were becoming nervous. More importantly, the FBI had started to notice the millions of dollars flowing out of Hollywood and into the pockets of mobsters. In 1941, federal authorities finally figured out the scheme. Willie Bioff, who was always the weak link, started to worry that he might get caught when a journalist started looking into Bioff's past and found out that he had been convicted before for running prostitutes. The pressure became too much. The FBI built their case carefully. They talked to studio executives, many of whom agreed to cooperate once they were promised they would not be prosecuted. They traced financial records. They documented the payments and the bribes. By the time they brought charges, the case was very strong. In 1943, Johnny Roselli, George Brown, Willie Bioff, and several others were officially charged with conspiracy and extortion. The trial showed the full extent of the operation. Over 10 years, the Chicago outfit had taken more than $2 million from Hollywood studios. That is equal to tens of millions of dollars today. The jury thought about it for just a few hours before deciding they were guilty. Roselli was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison at the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island, near Los Angeles, for a man who had spent the last 15 years living like a king. Prison was a terrible shock. The conditions at Terminal Island were harsh. The food was bad, the guards were cruel, and Roselli, as a known mobster, was a target for both guards who wanted to make trouble for him and other prisoners who wanted to make a name for themselves by fighting him. But Roselli adapted. He always adapted. He kept a low profile. He did his time. And he kept his connections to the outside world. Other mobsters in Terminal Island looked up to him. He became a leader among the prisoners, using his intelligence and charm to handle prison politics the same way he had handled power struggles in Hollywood. He also had powerful friends who were working to get him out. Mob lawyers filed appeals, political connections were used. Pressure was applied at the highest levels. After serving 3 years, Roselli was released in 1944. It was supposed to be for good behavior, but it was more likely because the right people had been paid off. His release from prison happened at the same time as huge changes were happening all across America. World War II was ending, and the country was about to enter a time of great wealth and change. The boom after the war would create new chances for legal businesses and also new chances for organized crime. Roselli came out of prison to find Hollywood different from when he had left. The extortion scheme had been exposed and destroyed. The studios were no longer paying protection money. His old friend Harry Cohn was still running Columbia Pictures, but their relationship was more complicated now. Cohn could not be seen spending too much time with someone who had been convicted of a crime. But Roselli had not spent 3 years in prison just feeling sorry for himself. He had been planning his future. He realized that Hollywood would always be important. But the real opportunities in the post-war years were somewhere else. Specifically, they were in the Nevada desert, where a quiet railroad town called Las Vegas was starting an amazing change. Before focusing on Las Vegas, though, Roselli wanted to keep his connections in Hollywood. Through his friendship with Brian Foy, a successful movie producer and the son of a famous vaudeville performer, Roselli managed to get involved in making legitimate movies. Foy ran a small production company called Eagle Lion Films, and he gave Roselli chances to work as a kind of producer on several projects. In 1948, Eagle Lion released 2 films that Roselli worked on, though exactly what he did was kept deliberately unclear. Cannon City was a tough movie about a prison escape, based on a true story of a mass escape from a prison in Colorado. Considering Roselli's own recent time in prison, you have to wonder how much of his input came from personal experience. The movie was a moderate success, and people praised it for its realistic style. The second film, He Walked by Night, was even better. It was a dark thriller based on the true story of a criminal who had killed a police officer in Los Angeles. The movie was notable for its sharp camera work and its honest portrayal of police work. More significantly, a young writer named Jack Webb worked on this film, and it would directly inspire his creation of Dragnet, one of the most influential police shows in television history. Roselli did not get official credit as a producer on either film, but people who knew about such things understood that he had been important in getting them made. He provided money, he made connections, and he solved problems. For a short time, it seemed like he might actually succeed in becoming a legitimate Hollywood producer, living off his criminal past, but not actively involved in crime anymore. But the attraction of the criminal world was too strong. The money was better. The excitement was addictive. And in the late 1940s, a new opportunity was appearing that would make Hollywood's profits look small. Las Vegas was calling in 1946. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel opened the Flamingo Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. Nevada, at first, it was a complete failure. The place lost a huge amount of money. The mob bosses who had provided the money for it were very angry. And Siegel himself would be murdered in Beverly Hills less than a year later. But the idea behind the Flamingo was a good one. Create a luxurious gambling resort in the Nevada desert, where gambling was legal and money could flow freely without worrying about police raids or payoffs. After Siegel's death, other mobsters took up his vision. The Flamingo got new money and reopened successfully. Other casinos followed, the Desert Inn, the Sands, the Riviera, the Stardust, the Tropicana. Each one was more spectacular than the last. They offered not just gambling, but also world-class entertainment, fancy restaurants, and luxury places to stay. The mob was literally building Las Vegas from nothing, changing a dusty railroad town into America's playground. Johnny Roselli saw the potential immediately. He had kept his connections to the Chicago outfit throughout his time in prison, and by the early 1950s, the outfit was heavily invested in the casinos of Las Vegas. They needed someone sophisticated, someone who understood both the mob world and the world of legitimate business, someone who could talk to casino managers, politicians, and entertainers. They needed Roselli. His official job was kept vague on purpose. To the Nevada Gaming Commission, he was a consultant for the casinos. To the mob, he was a host who helped bring in wealthy gamblers. He was the man who made sure their schemes to secretly take money ran smoothly. Skimming money was the key to the mob's profits in Las Vegas. On paper, the casinos reported certain earnings, paid their taxes, and gave the proper profits to their official stockholders. In reality, huge amounts of cash were taken off the top before any official counting happened. This untaxed, unrecorded money went back to mob bosses in Chicago, New York, Kansas City, and other places. The operation required very careful organization and complete loyalty. One accountant with a conscience could destroy the whole scheme. Roselli's job was to watch over this operation, making sure that the right people got their share, solving arguments and making problems go away. It was the perfect job for him. It had high status, it paid very well, and it required exactly the mix of social skills and willingness to be ruthless that he had developed over many years. He moved easily between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, keeping apartments in both cities. In Vegas, he was a regular at the best casinos. He sat in the best seats at championship boxing matches. He went to every major show, and most importantly, he built relationships with the entertainers who were turning Las Vegas into the entertainment capital of America. Frank Sinatra had been a teenage idol in the 1940s. He was the skinny Italian kid from Hoboken, whose voice made young girls faint. But by the early 1950s, his career was in bad shape. His voice had failed temporarily. His record sales had dropped a lot. His marriage to Ava Gardner was falling apart. Hollywood, which had welcomed him for a while, had moved on to newer stars. Then came From Here to Eternity. Sinatra desperately wanted the role of Private Angelo, Maggio in the 1953 movie version of James Jones's novel. The part required an Italian-American soldier who was scrappy and doomed. And Sinatra knew it could bring his career back to life. But Harry Cohn, the head of Columbia Pictures, did not want to hire him. He thought Sinatra's career was over, that he was a has-been. According to stories told in Hollywood, Johnny Roselli spoke to his old friend Harry Cohn on Sinatra's behalf. The truth is more complicated and less dramatic than the famous scene in The Godfather, where a movie producer wakes up with a horse's head in his bed. Roselli probably did talk to Cohn for Sinatra, but Cohn was a businessman first. He gave Sinatra the part because the singer agreed to work for very little money, only $8,000, and because Cohn recognized that Sinatra was perfect for the role. Sinatra won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, and his career exploded back to life. And whether or not Roselli had truly been the one who made this possible, Sinatra believed he owed the mob, and Johnny Roselli specifically, a debt of gratitude. Throughout the 1950s, Sinatra and Roselli became genuine friends. They spent time together in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. They went to each other's parties. Sinatra introduced Roselli to the group of stars that would become known as the Rat Pack: Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. The Rat Pack basically made the Sands Hotel their headquarters in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Their shows were legendary. They seemed to be made up on the spot, mixing music, comedy, and barely controlled chaos. They would sing, they would tell jokes, and they would make fun of each other and the audience. Audiences could not get enough. Every show was sold out, and more importantly, the casino floors were packed with people who had come to Vegas hoping to see the famous performers. Roselli moved through this world like a prince. He had a permanent table at the Sands. Everything was given to him for free. Meals, drinks, shows, hotel rooms. Stars and starlets wanted to be with him. He was charming, sophisticated, and dangerous enough to be interesting without being threatening. But underneath the glamorous surface, Roselli was still a mobster. He was still involved in the darker parts of organized crime. He helped arrange certain services for wealthy gamblers, like women or drugs, whatever a rich person might want. He settled arguments between different mob groups. He made sure that the skimming of money continued smoothly. And when someone needed to be reminded of what they owed, Roselli delivered the message. In late 1959 or early 1960, Frank Sinatra introduced Johnny Roselli to a beautiful young woman named Judith Campbell. She was 25 years old, recently divorced, and she moved in the same glamorous circles as Sinatra and his friends. Roselli found her attractive, sophisticated, and smart. They began a short romantic relationship. What happened next would get Roselli involved in one of the most shocking scandals in American history, one that would not fully come to light until years later. Sinatra, who had been friendly with the Kennedy family for years, introduced Judith Campbell to Senator John F. Kennedy in February 1960. Kennedy was running for the Democratic nomination for president, and he was well known for having relationships with women other than his wife. Campbell and Kennedy began a relationship that would continue throughout his time as president. But Campbell was also seeing other men, including San Giacomo, the boss of the Chicago outfit. Giacomo had risen to power after the deaths and imprisonments of the bosses before him, and by 1960, he was one of the most powerful mob bosses in America. He was also one of the most unstable, likely to have violent outbursts, suspicious of everyone, and increasingly careless about staying out of the public eye, which earlier mob bosses had been careful to do. Roselli had known Giacomo for years. They had worked together on various operations. Though Roselli was careful to keep some distance, Giacomo was unpredictable, and Roselli preferred to operate in the shadows, not in the spotlight. The exact nature of Judith Campbell's relationships with Kennedy, Giacomo, and Roselli is still debated. She later claimed that she had been a messenger, carrying information between the White House and the Chicago mob during Kennedy's presidency. Others say this is just something she made up to get attention. What is certain is that a woman was simultaneously close with the President of the United States and one of the most powerful mob bosses in the country. And Johnny Roselli was the connection between them through Campbell. Roselli had indirect access to the highest levels of American power. Whether this was planned or just happened by accident is unclear, but it meant that when the CIA came looking for mob connections in 1960, Johnny Roselli's name was at the top of their list. The 1960 presidential election was one of the closest in American history. John F. Kennedy, the young senator from Massachusetts, faced Vice President Richard Nixon in a campaign that would change American politics. Television played a crucial role. Kennedy's performance in the first televised debates made him look young and energetic compared to Nixon, who looked tired and sweaty. But in Chicago, a different factor may have decided the outcome. Illinois was an important state where the election could go either way, and Cook County, which includes Chicago, had a long history of election fraud stretching back many years. The political machine run by Mayor Richard J. Daley was famous for its ability to produce votes, and some of that ability came from working with organized crime, according to various sources. The Chicago outfit helped Kennedy win Illinois through a combination of voter fraud and influence with unions. San Giacomo later claimed that the mob had stolen the election for Kennedy, though such claims are hard to prove. What is certain is that Kennedy won Illinois by fewer than 9,000 votes out of nearly 5 million cast. And winning Illinois gave him the electoral votes he needed to become president. If the mob did help Kennedy win, they expected to be thanked. They expected the Justice Department to stop prosecuting organized crime so aggressively. They expected good treatment for their casinos in Las Vegas. They expected, in short, to be rewarded for their help. Instead, they got Bobby Kennedy. President Kennedy appointed his younger brother. Robert, as Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy was ambitious. He believed in doing what was right, and he was determined to make his mark by destroying organized crime in America. He greatly expanded the Justice Department section that dealt with organized crime. He allowed widespread wiretapping and surveillance of mob figures. He went after mob bosses with all the power of federal law enforcement. Sam Giancana was furious. He felt betrayed. The mob had helped elect Kennedy, and now Kennedy's brother was trying to put them all in prison. Giancana's anger was personal. He believed he had been personally double-crossed by the president. Roselli, who understood politics better than Giancana, saw the situation differently. He realized that the Kennedys had used the mob and then thrown them away. It was cold, but it was also smart politics. The Kennedys could not afford to seem soft on crime, and breaking with the mob publicly made them look like they were fighting crime. Roselli accepted it philosophically. They had been outsmarted. The thing to do now was to keep a low profile and wait for the pressure to pass. But then the CIA came to see him, and everything changed. To understand why the CIA would hire gangsters to kill Fidel Castro, you need to understand what Cuba meant to the American underworld in the 1950s. Under the rule of Fulgencio Batista, Cuba had become a paradise for the mob. Havana was like Las Vegas before Las Vegas existed, a tropical playground just 90 miles from Florida where Americans could gamble, drink, and have fun without legal restrictions. The mob had invested millions of dollars in Cuban casinos. Hotels and nightclubs, Meyer Lansky, the financial genius of organized crime, had essentially become Batista's partner. He ran the Riviera Casino and had interests in several other properties. Santo Trafficante Jr., the boss of the Mafia family in Tampa, controlled the Sans Souci and other major casinos. The Chicago outfit had investments there. So did mob families from New Orleans. Kansas City and New York, the amount of money was huge. Millions of dollars flowed through Havana's casinos every month. Much of it skimmed off the top and not taxed. It was the perfect setup. A dictator who would cooperate, very little oversight, and an endless stream of American tourists eager to spend their money. Johnny Roselli visited Cuba often in the late 1950s. He would gamble at the casinos, meet with Santo Trafficante Jr. and other mob figures, and enjoy Havana's famous nightlife. The city was intoxicating. The music, the rum, the beautiful women, the tropical nights that seemed to promise endless possibilities. Then, on January 1st, 1959, everything fell apart. Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces entered Havana. Batista fled into exile, and the mob's Cuban empire disappeared overnight. Castro's government took over the casinos and hotels. Millions of dollars in mob investments were lost. Santo Trafficante Jr. was put in prison for a short time, though he was eventually released and allowed to leave the country. The mob was devastated. They had lost one of their most profitable operations, and there was nothing they could do about it. The U.S. government was equally unhappy. Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union turned Cuba into a communist nation just 90 miles from American shores. The CIA started planning ways to remove Castro from power, but their early attempts were clumsy and unsuccessful. In 1960, someone at the CIA had what might be called a brilliant or insane idea. Why not hire the mob to kill Castro? The mob wanted him dead. They had experience with this kind of operation. They could be used in a way that the government could deny. If the plot was discovered, the U.S. government could say it was just criminals seeking revenge, not an official government operation. In August 1960, a CIA officer named Robert Maheu made contact with Johnny Roselli in Los Angeles. Robert Maheu was an interesting character. He used to work for the FBI, and then he became a private investigator and a fixer for the CIA. His official cover was running an office that did investigations for the billionaire Howard Hughes. But his real employer was the CIA. Maheu was sophisticated enough to move in mob circles without seeming out of place, and he had the connections to reach Roselli. Maheu approached Roselli at the Brown Derby restaurant in Beverly Hills. His offer was simple. Certain groups of Cuban exiles wanted Fidel Castro dead. These groups, a fiction, the CIA was behind everything, were willing to pay $150,000 for Castro's assassination. Would Roselli be interested in helping? Roselli's first reaction was doubtful. He did not need money. He was making hundreds of thousands of dollars every year from his Las Vegas operations. And assassination was tricky business, especially when the target was a foreign leader surrounded by security. But then Maheu told him the truth. This was not really about Cuban exiles. This was about the U.S. government. The CIA wanted Castro dead, and they were asking for Roselli's help. That changed everything. Roselli was many things. He was a criminal, a racketeer, and an extortionist. But he still considered himself a patriot. He had been born in Italy, but raised in America. He had built his life here. Despite his life of crime, or maybe because of it, he had a romantic idea of American power and his place in it. Roselli agreed to help. He refused the money, saying he wanted to serve his country. This decision, working for free on a CIA operation, would later be used as evidence that he was truly motivated by patriotism rather than money. Whether that is true or just good public relations is debatable, but it made a powerful story. Roselli brought Sam Giancana into the operation. Giancana, who was still furious at the Kennedys for their betrayal after the election, jumped at the chance. Here was a chance to hurt Castro, who had cost the mob millions, while also proving the mob's value to the government. Maybe Giancana thought this would earn them political protection for their other operations. Giancana brought in Santo Trafficante Jr., who had direct experience with Cuba and still had contacts on the island. These three mobsters became the CIA's unlikely team for assassination. The plan they came up with sounds like something from a spy novel. They would use poison pills that could be slipped into Castro's food or drink. The CIA's technical division developed special pills that contained botulinum toxin, one of the deadliest substances known. A single pill, if used correctly, would kill Castro within hours, and the death would look like food poisoning. In late 1960 and early 1961, the poisoned pills were smuggled into Cuba. Traficante's contacts, Cubans who had worked in the old casinos and had access to restaurants that Castro went to, were given the pills and told how to use them. All they had to do was drop a pill in Castro's drink when he was not looking. But Castro never died. The pills were never successfully used. The messengers got scared, or the opportunities never came up, or Castro's security was too good. One story says the pills were actually delivered, but had gone bad in Cuba's heat and humidity, becoming useless. Another version says the messenger lost his nerve at the last moment. Meanwhile, the CIA was planning a larger operation. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the CIA landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast, hoping to start a popular uprising against Castro. The invasion was a complete failure. Castro's forces destroyed the invasion force within 3 days, and President Kennedy was humiliated. The failed invasion made Castro even more suspicious and security conscious. which made the assassination plots even harder to carry out. But the CIA did not give up. They kept trying, developing increasingly strange schemes to kill the Cuban leader. After the Bay of Pigs disaster, President Kennedy approved Operation Mongoose, a huge secret program aimed at overthrowing Castro through sabotage, propaganda, and yes, assassination. The operation was run by Edward Lansdale, a legendary CIA operative, and coordinated through a group called the Special Group Augmented, which included Attorney General Bobby Kennedy. The irony was rich. Bobby Kennedy, who was publicly prosecuting mobsters, was secretly approving operations that depended on mob connections. But the Kennedys were practical when it came to foreign policy, and they wanted Castro gone by any means necessary. Roselli and his mob associates continued their involvement, working with a CIA officer named William Harvey, who had taken over the program to assassinate Castro. Harvey was a heavy drinker suspicious, and a cold warrior who fit the stereotype of the old-school CIA operative. He was suspicious of everyone, willing to do anything for the mission, and completely unconcerned with legality or ethics. Harvey and Roselli developed an unusual friendship. They would meet at safe houses in Miami and have long conversations about everything from the nature of power to the best way to kill someone without leaving evidence. Harvey respected Roselli's professionalism and ability to keep secrets. Roselli appreciated Harvey's directness and commitment to the mission. The attempts to assassinate Castro continued throughout 1961 and 1962, each one more elaborate and unlikely than the last. The CIA developed exploding cigars that would detonate when Castro lit them, a diving suit contaminated with fungus and bacteria, to be given to Castro, who liked scuba diving, a booby-trapped conch shell placed where Castro liked to dive, more poison pills delivered through various channels, plans involving Castro's girlfriends, plans to embarrass Castro by making his beard fall out, the theory being that if he lost his famous beard, he would lose his revolutionary appeal. None of them worked. Castro seemed to have 9 lives. Or maybe he just had excellent security and good luck. Roselli made many trips to Miami, meeting with CIA officers and Cuban exiles. He kept complete silence about his CIA work, never bragging or even hinting about his involvement to anyone outside the operation. This ability to keep things separate was classic Roselli. He had learned long ago that survival in the criminal world depended on knowing when to keep your mouth shut. But working for the CIA gave Roselli something beyond patriotic satisfaction. It gave him leverage. He now had powerful friends in the government who owed him favors. When the FBI started looking too closely at his Las Vegas operations or his immigration status, Roselli could make a phone call. Someone at the CIA would make a phone call, and suddenly the FBI would back off, at least for a while. This protection would not last forever, but for a few years in the early 1960s, Johnny Roselli was essentially untouchable. He was a mob figure with direct connections to America's intelligence agency. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and charged with the murder, but he was killed himself 2 days later by a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby before he could go to trial. The Warren Commission would later conclude that Oswald acted alone, but conspiracy theories appeared immediately and have never gone away. Where was Johnny Roselli on November 22, 1963? According to what he later said himself, he was in Los Angeles, going about his normal business. There is no evidence placing him in Dallas, and no serious researcher has ever suggested he was directly involved in Kennedy's assassination. But Roselli knew people who might have been involved. He knew Jack Ruby, who had connections to the mob. He knew Santo Trafficante Jr. and Sam Giancana, both of whom had reason to hate Kennedy. He knew about the complicated web of connections between anti-Castro Cubans, CIA operatives, and organized crime figures. In the years after Kennedy's assassination, Roselli would hear rumors, pieces of conversation, hints of knowledge from people who claimed to know what really happened. Whether he ever knew the truth is questionable, but he certainly heard enough to develop his own theories. One theory that emerged later, promoted by Roselli himself when it was useful to him, was that Castro had ordered Kennedy's assassination in revenge for the CIA's attempts to kill him. According to this version, the mobsters and CIA officers trying to kill Castro had accidentally taught Cuban intelligence how to assassinate the head of state, and Castro had used those lessons against Kennedy. Another theory whispered in mob circles was that the Chicago outfit had ordered the killing in revenge for Bobby Kennedy's prosecutions. This version had Sam Giancana or Santo Trafficante Jr. arranging the murder, possibly using the same networks and techniques developed for the Castro plots. A third theory suggested that rogue CI elements, angry at Kennedy for the Bay of Pigs failure and his perceived weakness on communism, had organized the assassination and used mob connections to keep the operation separate from official CIA control. Roselli, always careful, never committed to any single theory. He would hint, suggest, imply, but he would never state clearly what he believed. This ambiguity served him well. It made him interesting to investigators and journalists, while never giving them quite enough to build a case or write a definitive story. What is certain is that Kennedy's assassination changed everything for the mob's connection to the CIA. The plots to kill Castro were quietly ended. The special relationship between the intelligence community and organized crime began to weaken, and the Kennedy brothers, who had been planning to crack down even harder on the mob in a second term, were no longer a threat. At least John was not. Bobby Kennedy continued as Attorney General under President Lyndon Johnson, but his heart was no longer in it. The death of his brother had devastated him. He resigned in 1964 to run for the Senate, eventually becoming a senator from New York, and later a presidential candidate himself until his own assassination in 1968. For Johnny Roselli, the years after Kennedy's death would bring new challenges and eventually the beginning of his downfall. J. Edgar Hoover, the longtime director of the FBI, had always been doubtful about the mob's supposed power. For years, he had claimed that organized crime was exaggerated, that it was not as big a problem as some people said. This position was partly due to his own prejudices and partly due to the fact that mob figures had allegedly compromised him with evidence of his personal life. But by the mid-1960s, even Hoover could not deny the reality of organized crime's influence. Bobby Kennedy's campaign had produced results, including the important 1963 testimony of Joe Valachi, a low-level mob soldier who became the first member of the Mafia to publicly admit its existence and describe its structure. The FBI increased its investigations of organized crime, using new tools like electronic surveillance and the RICO Act, which allowed them to prosecute people for being part of a criminal organization. Johnny Roselli, despite his CIA connections, was a prime target. The FBI had been building a case against Roselli for years, focusing on several weak points. First, his citizenship status was questionable. He claimed to have been born in Chicago as John Roselli, but the FBI suspected he was actually Filippo Sacco, an Italian immigrant. If they could prove this, They could prosecute him for falsifying documents and possibly send him back to Italy. Second, his Las Vegas operations were under investigation. The FBI knew about the skimming operations at various casinos, and they were building cases against the mob figures who controlled them. Roselli's role as a fixer and coordinator made him vulnerable. Third, his general mob activities, the gambling, the loan sharking, the corruption, gave the FBI many possible ways to prosecute him. But Roselli had his CIA connections, and for a while, those connections provided protection. When the FBI got too close, Roselli would contact his CIA friends. Someone would make a call. The investigation would be redirected or slowed down. It was not complete immunity, but it bought him time. The problem was that the CIA's patience with Roselli was running out. The Castro assassination plots had failed. The mob's connection to the CIA was becoming embarrassing. And as more people learned about the plots, the risk of public exposure grew. The CIA began to distance itself from Roselli and the other mobsters who had worked on Operation Mongoose. In 1967, federal authorities discovered a large cheating operation at the Friars Club in Beverly Hills. This was a fancy social club for people in the entertainment industry. The scheme was clever. Cheaters had installed a sophisticated system of peepholes and signals that allowed gamblers to see their opponents' cards during high-stakes games of gin rummy. The operation had been running for years and had taken wealthy players for millions of dollars. When the FBI discovered it, they found Johnny Roselli right in the middle of it. This was a stupid, unnecessary crime for a man of Roselli's status. He did not need the money. The risk of getting caught was huge. The potential prison time was significant, but Roselli had gotten involved anyway. Maybe out of greed, maybe out of boredom, maybe out of a misplaced confidence that his CIA connections would protect him from prosecution. They did not. In 1968, Roselli was found guilty of conspiracy and racketeering in connection with the Friars Club scheme. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. It was his second major conviction and time in prison. The judge was not impressed with Roselli's attempts to mention his CIA work as a reason for a lighter sentence. Whatever protection Roselli had once enjoyed had disappeared. He reported to prison in 1969, now in his mid-60s, and facing the grim reality that his later years would be spent behind bars. The conditions were better than at Terminal Island decades earlier. He was sent to a minimum security facility. But prison is prison, no matter how comfortable. While Roselli was locked up, the world outside continued to change. The mob's control over Las Vegas was weakening as legitimate companies discovered they could make huge profits from casinos. Howard Hughes had started buying up casinos in Las Vegas. Using his enormous wealth to outbid the mob for properties, other companies would follow, gradually pushing organized crime out of its stronghold in Nevada. The mob itself was changing too. The old bosses were dying or going to prison. Younger men were taking over, and they did not have the same connection to Roselli that the previous generation had. Sam Giancana, Roselli's old partner in the Castro plots, was in exile in Mexico to avoid testifying before a grand jury. Santo Traficante Jr. was under constant FBI surveillance. The network that had supported Roselli for decades was falling apart. Roselli served 3 years before being released on parole in 1973. He was 78 years old, a relic from another era, but he was not done yet. He still had connections. He still had knowledge. And that knowledge was about to become very dangerous. While serving time for the Friars Club scandal, Roselli faced another legal problem. This was the immigration fraud case that the FBI had been building for years. Federal investigators had finally gathered enough evidence to prove that John Roselli was actually Filippo Sacco, an Italian immigrant who had entered the country legally as a child, but had later created a false identity. The implications were serious. Roselli had falsified documents, lied under oath, and fraudulently claimed U.S. citizenship. The case went to trial in 1971, while Roselli was still in prison. The evidence was not direct, but it was convincing. Investigators had found Roselli's family members in Boston, obtained records from Italy showing Filippo Sacco's birth, and documented when John Roselli had first appeared in official records. Roselli's defense was that he had used the name John Roselli for so long that it had become his real identity. His lawyers argued that their client genuinely believed himself to be John Roselli, that whatever youthful mistakes he had made in taking a new name had been erased by decades of living as that person. It was a creative argument, but the jury did not believe it. Roselli was convicted of immigration fraud and conspiracy. The conviction carried the possibility of being sent back to Italy, a country he barely remembered and where he knew no one. At 66 years old, the thought of being sent to a foreign country was frightening. But the process of deportation moved slowly, and Roselli's lawyers filed appeal after appeal, buying time. Meanwhile, he finished serving his sentence for the Friars Club case and was released on parole in 1973. Roselli's release from prison should have been the beginning of a quiet retirement. He was 78 years old. He had served his time. He had paid his debt to society, such as it was. The logical thing would have been to disappear somewhere, live off whatever money he had hidden away, and enjoy his final years in peace. But Roselli could not let go. He returned to Los Angeles and Miami, reconnecting with old friends and associates. He went to the horse races. He played golf. He went to social events. He maintained the same lifestyle he had enjoyed for decades. As if nothing had changed, his relationship with the mob was complicated now. The younger generation of mobsters did not know him personally. They had heard stories about Handsome Johnny, the legendary fixer who had worked with Capone and plotted to kill Castro. But to them, he was a relic from the past. Worse, he was a risk. Someone who knew too much about old operations. Someone whose continued freedom depended on the goodwill of federal prosecutors, who might offer him deals in exchange for his testimony. The deportation case hung over Roselli's head like a threat. His lawyers continued fighting it. But the odds were not good. If he was sent back to Italy, he would lose everything: his home, his friends, his life in America. The mob knew this, and they knew that a desperate Roselli might make a deal with prosecutors to avoid being deported. Even more dangerous, Roselli's CIA connections were becoming public knowledge. Journalists were starting to investigate the Castro assassination plots. People in Congress were asking questions about the relationship between the intelligence community and organized crime. The story that Roselli had kept secret for over a decade was threatening to explode into public view. In 1971, a journalist named Jack Anderson published a story about the mob's plots with the CIA to kill Castro. Though he did not initially name Roselli, the revelation was huge. It confirmed long-standing rumors about the darker side of U.S. intelligence operations. More stories followed, each adding details, each bringing investigators closer to the full truth. Roselli, caught between the mob and the government, both of whom saw him as a possible threat, began to realize how dangerous his position had become. He had spent his entire adult life navigating dangerous situations. But this was different. He was not a young man anymore. His friends and protectors were dead. In prison, or too weak to help him, he was alone. And people on multiple sides wanted him silenced. In 1974, the Senate began planning broad investigations into abuses by the intelligence community. The Watergate scandal had shaken America's faith in government, and there was a growing demand for honesty and accountability. The CIA's assassination plots against foreign leaders were exactly the kind of scandal that the new congressional committees wanted to expose. Roselli knew what was coming. He knew he would be called to testify, and he knew that testifying, or refusing to testify, could get him killed. In January 1975, the U.S. Senate established the Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. Led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, it would become known simply as the Church Committee. Its mission was to investigate abuses by the CIA, FBI, NSA, and other intelligence agencies, particularly their surveillance of Americans and their plots against foreign leaders. The committee had enormous power. They could demand that witnesses appear. They could access secret documents. They could offer immunity to encourage people to talk. And they were highly motivated to expose the full scope of intelligence agency wrongdoing after Watergate. One of their main targets was the CIA's plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. Journalists had reported pieces of the story, but the full details remained secret. The Church Committee wanted everything. Who ordered the plots? Who carried them out? What methods were used? And why did they all fail? And that meant they needed Johnny Roselli. In April 1975, Roselli was ordered to testify before the committee in a private session. This put him in an impossible situation. If he refused to testify, he could be held in contempt of Congress, which meant more prison time. If he testified truthfully about the mob's involvement, he would be breaking omerta, the Mafia's code of silence, and signing his own death warrant. If he lied, he could be prosecuted for perjury. Roselli's solution was to walk a fine line. He would testify, but only about matters that were already public knowledge, or that mainly involved the CIA rather than the mob. He would answer questions about the Castro plots, because multiple people already knew about them, and the story was coming out anyway. But he would minimize the mob's role and protect the identities of people still in the criminal world. His first appearance before the Church Committee was on April 23, 1975. The session was held in secret, with only senators, staff, and a few CIA officials present. Roselli was 70 years old now, still dressed perfectly, still projecting an air of sophistication, despite his age and recent time in prison. The senators questioned him for hours. They wanted to know everything: how the CIA had recruited him, what methods had been proposed to kill Castro, who else was involved, whether there were connections to President Kennedy's assassination. Roselli was careful in his answers. He confirmed the basic facts of the Castro assassination plots. Yes, the CIA had recruited him through Robert Maheu. Yes, he brought in Sam Giancana and Santo Traficante Jr. Yes, they developed poison pills and other schemes. Yes, the plots had all failed, but he was vague about details. He could not remember exact dates. He was not sure about certain meetings. Some documents he was shown did not help him remember. It was a masterful performance of seeming to cooperate while actually revealing as little as possible. The senators were frustrated, but not angry. They recognized that Roselli was trying to protect himself and others. They gave him immunity for his testimony about the CIA operations, which meant he could not be prosecuted based on what he told them about the assassination plots. But immunity from prosecution was not the same as protection from the mob. On June 19, 1975, less than 2 months after Roselli's first appearance before the church committee, Sam Giancana was murdered in his home in Oak Park, Illinois. Giancana had returned to the United States after years in exile, believing he had arranged a safe return. He was also scheduled to testify before the church committee about the Castro plots. Like Roselli, he had been ordered to appear. Like Roselli, he knew too much. On the night of June 19th, someone entered Giancana's home while he was preparing a late-night snack of sausages and peppers. The killer shot him once in the back of the head, then 6 more times in a circle around his mouth and throat. It was a symbolic mob killing, suggesting that Giancana had talked too much. The murder was never solved. No one was ever charged. But everyone in the criminal world understood the message. Talk to the government and you die. It did not matter how powerful you had once been. It did not matter what your excuse was. The penalty for breaking omerta was death. Roselli got the message loud and clear. He had already testified once. But there was a difference between him and Giancana. Roselli had been careful. He had minimized what he said. He had protected people. But now, with Giancana dead, the stakes were even higher. The church committee wanted him back. They had more questions, and Roselli, facing deportation and needing every bit of leverage he could get, could not refuse. On September 22, 1975, Johnny Roselli appeared before the church committee for a second time. By now, the committee's investigation had uncovered more details about the CIA's connection to the mob. They had interviewed CIA officers. They had reviewed secret documents. They knew Roselli had not been completely honest in his first appearance. This time, the questioning was more intense. The senators wanted details. They wanted names. They wanted to understand the full scope of the operation and how it related to other CIA activities. Roselli, always the careful operator, gave them more than he had before, but still not everything. He confirmed additional details about the poison pill schemes. He discussed some of the CIA officers he had worked with, including William Harvey, who had run the Castro assassination program. He talked about the meetings in Miami, the Cuban contacts, the careful planning that had gone into each failed attempt, but he was still protecting people. He minimized Santo Trafficante Jr. as role, suggesting Trafficante had been more of a consultant than an active participant. He avoided discussing other mob figures who had been somewhat involved. He presented himself as the main mob connection, taking on personal risk to protect others. The senators asked him about a particularly controversial theory. Was there any connection between the CIA's plots with the mob against Castro and President Kennedy's assassination? Had the assassination techniques developed to kill Castro somehow been used against Kennedy? This was dangerous ground. Roselli had heard rumors and theories for years. He may have believed some of them, but publicly connecting Kennedy's assassination to the Castro plots would put him at even greater risk. Roselli's answer was carefully worded. He suggested it was possible that Castro, knowing about the attempts to kill him, had ordered Kennedy's murder in revenge. This theory had the advantage of being believable, while not directly accusing anyone Roselli needed to protect. It pointed the finger at Castro, a foreign enemy, rather than at the mob or rogue CIA elements. The senators found this theory fascinating, and it would later be included in their final report. Whether Roselli actually believed it or was simply deflecting is unknown. He was nothing if not a skilled storyteller, capable of shaping stories to serve his purposes. After hours of testimony, Roselli was dismissed. The committee thanked him for his cooperation. They assured him his testimony was valuable to their investigation. but they could not protect him from what happened next. In November 1975, the Church Committee released its interim report on assassination plots against foreign leaders. The report detailed the CIA's attempts to kill Fidel Castro, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, and other leaders considered hostile to U.S. interests. The section on Castro was particularly detailed, thanks in large part to Roselli's testimony. The report described the poison pills, the exploding cigars, the contaminated diving suit, and other strange schemes. It named names, not just of CIA officers, but of the mob figures who participated. Johnny Roselli's name was in the report. So were Sam Giancana's and Santo Traficante Jr.'s. The full scope of the mob's connection to the CIA was now public record. The reaction was explosive. Americans were shocked and outraged. The CIA had recruited mobsters to commit murder on behalf of the U.S. government. The same government that was supposedly fighting organized crime had partnered with organized crime to kill foreign leaders. It seemed like something from a movie, not real life, for Roselli. The publication of the report was a disaster. His cooperation with the committee, even his carefully limited cooperation, was now known to everyone. The mob saw him as an informer. The government saw him as a used-up asset with nothing left to offer. He had become someone who could be disposed of. His lawyers continued fighting the deportation case, but the outlook was grim. The immigration fraud conviction stood. Unless something dramatic changed, Roselli would eventually be sent to Italy, effectively exiled from the only country he had ever really known. He spent more time in Florida now, particularly around Miami. The weather was better for his aging body. He had friends there, other retired mob figures living out their final years in the sunshine. And perhaps he felt safer in Florida, away from the centers of mob power in Chicago and New York. But nowhere was truly safe anymore. The first half of 1976 was a time of increasing fear for Johnny Roselli. He knew he was in danger. He took precautions, changing his routines, watching for surveillance, staying in public places. But he also knew that if the mob really wanted him dead, precautions would only delay the inevitable. His health was failing. Years of smoking had damaged his lungs. The tuberculosis from his youth had left lasting effects. He tired easily and had trouble breathing. He looked older than his 70 years. His once handsome face was now deeply lined and worn. In April 1976, the church committee called him back for more testimony. This would be his third and final appearance. By now, they had asked most of their questions about the Castro plots, but they wanted him to address new information that had emerged about other CIA operations and about possible connections to Kennedy's assassination. Roselli testified again, still walking the same fine line between cooperation and self-preservation. He could not give them nothing. That would anger the committee and could result in charges of contempt. But he could not give them everything. That would sign his death warrant for sure. After this final testimony, Roselli returned to Florida. He kept up his usual routines: golf, lunch at his regular restaurants, visits with friends. To someone who did not know him well, he seemed like any other elderly retiree enjoying the Florida lifestyle. But those close to him noticed changes. He was more withdrawn. He drank more. He made odd comments about his legacy, about how he wanted to be remembered. He talked about writing a book someday, though whether he was serious or just thinking out loud is unclear. In July 1976, Roselli was still fighting his deportation case, but the options were running out. His lawyers had used up most of their appeals. Unless something dramatic happened, He would be sent back to Italy within the next year or two. On July 28, 1976, Roselli had dinner plans at a restaurant called The Landings in Fort Lauderdale. He was meeting with associates of Santo Trafficante Jr., men he had known for years, men he trusted as much as anyone could be trusted in the criminal world. He dressed carefully that evening, as he always did, a nice suit, well-pressed, good shoes, his hair combed perfectly. Even at 70, facing possible death, Johnny Roselli kept up his standards. He drove to the restaurant in his car and parked. He entered the Landings and was greeted warmly by his dinner companions. They exchanged polite conversation. They ordered drinks. They looked at menus. Everything seemed normal, routine. Just another business dinner. What they discussed during that meal will never be known for certain. Maybe they talked about the old days. Maybe they discussed Roselli's legal problems. Maybe they made small talk about nothing in particular. Or maybe they delivered a message. The mob had decided Roselli was too dangerous to leave alive. After dinner, Roselli left the restaurant with his companions. He never made it home. His car was found in the parking lot the next day. Untouched, his apartment was empty. He had simply disappeared for the next 10 days. Investigators searched for Johnny Roselli. His sister Edith, who lived in California, reported him missing. FBI agents, who had been monitoring Roselli for years, started an investigation. Miami police followed leads, but no one could find him. It was as if he had been erased from existence. August 7, 1976, Dumbfoundling Bay near Miami. The fishermen who discovered the oil drum floating in the bay initially thought it was just trash, but something about it seemed wrong. It floated strangely, as if weighted down, but still floating enough to stay on the surface. When he radioed for help and the police arrived, they approached the drum carefully. Rust had already started forming on the metal from 10 days in salt water. The lid was sealed tight, welded shut by whoever had prepared it. Using cutting tools, investigators forced the drum open. The smell hit them first, the unmistakable odor of decay, made worse by days of heat and being enclosed inside the drum. Crammed into the small space was a body. The body was badly decomposed, made worse by the time in the water and the Florida heat. But certain details were immediately clear. The body had been mutilated. The legs had been cut off at the thighs to make the body fit in the barrel. Heavy chains were wrapped around the body. Evidence of an attempt to weigh the drum down so it would never surface. The plan had almost worked. Whoever killed Johnny Roselli and stuffed him in that barrel had intended for him to disappear forever, to become another unsolved missing person case. But either they had not used enough weight, or gases from decomposition had provided enough lift to bring the barrel to the surface. Dental records confirmed what investigators already suspected. The body was Johnny Roselli. He had been suffocated, probably strangled or smothered, before being mutilated and stuffed into the drum. The removal of the legs had been done after death, a practical necessity rather than additional torture. The murder had all the signs of a professional mob killing. The careful disposal, the attempt to make the body disappear forever, the brutality that served both practical purposes and sent a message to anyone else thinking about talking to the government. The Miami-Dade Police Department opened a murder investigation. Though everyone involved knew the chances of solving the case were small, mob killings almost never get solved unless someone talks. And no one was going to talk about killing Johnny Roselli. The FBI joined the investigation, given Roselli's history as an FBI target and witness. They interviewed known associates. They checked phone records. They analyzed the oil drum for fingerprints, and other evidence. They questioned Roselli's dinner companions from July 28th. Santo Trafficante Jr., whose associates had been the last to see Roselli alive, denied any knowledge of the murder. He claimed they had had a nice dinner. Roselli had left in good spirits, and he had no idea what happened afterward. Without physical evidence linking Trafficante to the murder, prosecutors could not charge him. The investigation developed several theories about who had ordered the killing. Theory 1. Santo Trafficante Jr. ordered the murder. This was the most popular theory among investigators. Trafficante had been Roselli's partner in the Castro plots. He had been named in the church committee reports. He had the most to lose if Roselli decided to tell everything he knew. And Roselli had last been seen alive with Trafficante's associates. The indirect evidence was strong, but without witnesses or physical evidence, it was not enough for prosecution. Theory 2. The Chicago outfit ordered the killing. Roselli had been Chicago's representative in Los Angeles and Las Vegas for decades. The current Chicago bosses might have decided he was a risk, especially given his cooperation with the church committee. They could have contacted Trafficante to carry out the murder on their behalf. Theory 3. A combination of mob families acted together. Multiple crime families had been exposed by Roselli's testimony. They might have collectively decided he had to go and coordinated the killing to ensure it was done professionally. Theory 4. Rogue CIA elements ordered the murder. This was the conspiracy theory favored by some investigators and journalists. According to this version, CIA officers who had worked on the Castro plots feared that Roselli might reveal even more damaging information about other operations. They had arranged his murder to silence him permanently, possibly using mob connections to carry it out. The truth probably lies somewhere among the first three theories. The mob had clear reasons and the ability to do it. The CIA theory, while dramatic, lacks supporting evidence. What is almost certain is that multiple mob bosses knew about the plan, even if only one family actually carried it out. Roselli's murder sent shock waves through the criminal world and the intelligence community. Other witnesses who had testified before the church committee suddenly became very security conscious. Some went into hiding. Others hired bodyguards. A few tried to make peace with mob figures they had accidentally exposed in their testimony. But Roselli's death also had an unexpected effect. It made him more valuable as a symbol than he had ever been alive. His murder proved that the mob's connection to the CIA was real, that powerful forces would kill to keep secrets buried. It confirmed everything the church committee had uncovered and suggested there were even darker secrets yet to be revealed. Journalists wrote books about Roselli and the mob's plots with the CIA. His name appeared in countless conspiracy theories about Kennedy's assassination, Castro, and the hidden history of American intelligence operations. In death, Johnny Roselli became a legend, the man who knew too much and paid the ultimate price. His estate was a mess. The various legal cases against him, the deportation proceedings, civil lawsuits, tax liens, all had to be resolved without him. His sister Edith inherited what little remained of his assets after lawyers and the government took their shares. The Immigration and Naturalization Service closed its case. Filippo Sacco, a.k.a. John Roselli, would not be deported to Italy. He had found a different kind of exile at the bottom of Biscayne Bay. Before being pulled back into the light one final time, the murder investigation remained officially open for years, though no new leads ever emerged. Eventually, it was filed away as a cold case. One of thousands of unsolved murders in Miami's history, the file remains open to this day. Though no detective has actively worked the case in decades, Santo Traficante Jr., died in 1987 from kidney failure, taking whatever he knew about Roselli's murder to his grave. Other mob figures connected to the case have similarly died, each one closing off possible leads. The oil drum that had been Roselli's coffin was eventually destroyed as evidence. The spot where it was found in Biscayne Bay has no marker, nothing to indicate that this was the final resting place. However brief, of one of organized crime's most interesting figures. Who was Johnny Roselli really? After 70 years of carefully constructed identities and deliberate mystery, the question does not have a simple answer. He was born Filippo Sacco in a small Italian village. He was the son of peasants who dreamed of a better life. He came to America as a child, carrying nothing but his family's hopes and desperation. He should have lived and died in obscurity, maybe working in a factory or on the docks, raising a family, leaving no mark on history. Instead, he completely recreated himself. He erased Filippo Sacco and became John Roselli. He changed from an immigrant kid in East Boston into a sophisticated mobster moving between Hollywood parties and Las Vegas casinos. He went from running numbers on street corners to plotting the assassination of a foreign leader in partnership with the CIA. This ability to reinvent himself was Roselli's greatest talent. He understood instinctively what each situation required and adapted himself accordingly. In Chicago's violent bootlegging wars of the 1920s, he could be tough and ruthless. In Hollywood's glamorous world of the 1930s, he became charming and sophisticated. In Las Vegas's high-stakes gambling environment of the 1950s, he was the ultimate fixer and diplomat. In the CIA's secret world of the 1960s, he presented himself as a patriotic asset. Willing to serve his country, each version was genuine in its way. And each was also a performance. The real Roselli, if such a person existed, remained hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed personalities. Roselli's relationship with Hollywood reveals something important about American culture in the 20th century. The entertainment industry and organized crime have always been connected, sometimes as enemies, but often as partners. The mob's takeover of Hollywood through the IATS Union was not just about extortion. It showed that legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises operate on similar principles: control of workers, manipulation of markets, and the careful use of pressure to get what you want. Roselli understood this better than most. He recognized that Harry Cohn, the ruthless studio head, and Frank Nitti, the sophisticated mob boss, were basically the same type of person. Men who understood power and were not bothered by using it. The line between legitimate and criminal business practices was often unclear, especially in an industry as competitive as Hollywood. This is why Roselli could move so easily between worlds. He could attend a movie premiere at night and meet with mob bosses during the day, because he understood that both worlds operated on the same basic principles: power, money, and the careful management of public image. The mob's Hollywood operations also revealed a pattern that would repeat throughout Roselli's career. First came success, then overconfidence, and finally exposure. The extortion scheme worked brilliantly until it became too successful, too greedy. The mob took millions. But their very success attracted attention and eventually destroyed the operation. Las Vegas was supposed to be different, unlike Hollywood, where the mob had to operate in the shadows and deal with studio executives who resented their presence. Las Vegas was built by the mob from the beginning. The casinos existed because mobsters like Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, and the Chicago outfit had the vision and money to create them. For a while, it was perfect. The casinos made money constantly. The skimming operations sent millions in untaxed profits back to mob bosses. Politicians were cooperative. Law enforcement looked the other way. The Nevada Gaming Commission's oversight was minimal. Roselli thrived in this environment. His role as a host and consultant gave him prestige without obvious criminal involvement. He could claim he was just a legitimate businessman helping casinos attract wealthy customers. And technically, that is what he was doing. The fact that he was also overseeing criminal operations was something that could not be easily proven. But Las Vegas's golden age for the mob was limited. Howard Hughes's buying spree in the late 1960s signaled the beginning of the end. Once legitimate companies realized they could make huge profits from gambling without the complications of mob involvement, the change was unavoidable. The mob had built Las Vegas, but they could not keep it. They were too greedy, too violent, too visible. Corporate America, with its armies of lawyers and accountants, proved more effective at taking profits from gambling than mobsters ever were. Roselli saw this change happening, but could not stop it. He was a product of a particular era, the middle of the 20th century, when organized crime reached its peak of power and influence in America. That era was ending, and men like Roselli were becoming unnecessary. The connection between the mob and the CIA represents one of the strangest chapters in American history. The same government that was prosecuting mobsters for racketeering and extortion was simultaneously hiring them to assassinate foreign leaders. The hypocrisy was stunning, but from a certain practical perspective, it made sense. The mob had abilities that the CIA lacked. They had experience in murder, connections to Cuban exiles, and the ability to deny involvement. If the plot was discovered, the government could claim it was just criminals acting on their own. From the CIA's perspective, it was a clever solution to a difficult problem. From Roselli's perspective, the CIA connection offered something valuable, leverage, for years. His relationship with the CIA provided protection from other federal investigations. When the FBI got too close, a phone call to the right CIA officer could slow things down. But did Roselli really work for the CIA out of patriotism, as he claimed? Or was it purely practical, a way to gain protection and status? The truth is probably both. Roselli was capable of genuine patriotic feeling. He had spent his entire adult life in America. He had built his identity as an American, and he had absorbed American values, even while breaking American laws. When the CIA asked for help against Castro, he probably did feel a genuine desire to serve his country. But he was also thinking about the benefits. Patriotism and practicality are not mutually exclusive, and Roselli was skilled at finding situations where he could serve multiple purposes at once. The tragedy is that the CIA connection, which had protected him for years, ultimately contributed to his death. By testifying before the church committee about the Castro plots, Roselli exposed not just CIA secrets, but mob secrets. He made himself useless to both organizations. No discussion of Johnny Roselli would be complete without addressing the Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories. Roselli's connections to the key people, the mob, the CIA, anti-Castro Cubans, and Judith Campbell, have made him a central figure in alternative theories about who really killed President Kennedy. The reality is almost certainly less dramatic than the conspiracy theories suggest. Lee Harvey Oswald, a troubled former Marine with Marxist beliefs and a history of instability, probably did act alone in killing Kennedy. The Warren Commission, despite its flaws, probably got the basic story right, but Roselli's knowledge of the various plots and counterplots surrounding Kennedy. Castro, and the mob made him valuable to conspiracy theorists. He knew about connections that most people did not. He had heard rumors and pieces of information, and in his later years, facing deportation and desperate for something to use as leverage, he may have encouraged speculation about what he knew. His suggestion to the church committee that Castro might have ordered Kennedy's assassination in revenge for the CIA plots was probably a way to redirect attention rather than a genuine belief. It pointed suspicion away from the mob and toward a foreign enemy. It was the kind of clever misdirection that Roselli had perfected over decades. Roselli's murder was unavoidable once he testified before the church committee. The mob's code was clear. You do not talk to the government ever for any reason. The fact that Roselli had immunity, that he tried to minimize what he revealed, that he protected people when he could, none of that mattered. He had broken omerta, and the penalty was death. Sam Giancana's murder had been the warning. Roselli's murder was the lesson. Anyone thinking about cooperating with investigators could look at what happened to Roselli and understand their fate. The brutality of the murder, the suffocation, the dismemberment, the oil drum, served multiple purposes. It ensured the body would disappear, removing physical evidence. It sent a message to other potential informants, and it provided a certain satisfaction to the killers. A brutal end for a man who had violated the most sacred rule of their world. The fact that the barrel floated to the surface was almost poetic. Roselli had spent his life trying to stay hidden, operating in the shadows, avoiding attention, even in death. They tried to make him disappear forever, but he surfaced anyway, literally floating back into public view, forcing one final reckoning with his extraordinary life. Johnny Roselli's story is in many ways a dark reflection of the American dream. He arrived in America as a poor immigrant child and rose to positions of wealth, power, and influence. He associated with movie stars and senators. He helped shape Las Vegas and Hollywood. He played a role, however small, in Cold War history. But he achieved all this through crime, violence, and corruption. His American dream was built on bootlegging, extortion, gambling, and murder. He represented the dark side of American capitalism, the recognition that the quickest path to success often involves breaking the rules. His relationship with the government reveals another truth about America. That being practical often matters more than principles. The same government that imprisoned Roselli for extortion later hired him to commit murder. The same FBI that spent decades investigating him later relied on his testimony to understand CIA operations. American institutions are perfectly capable of partnering with criminals when it serves their purposes. Roselli's change from Filippo Sacco to Johnny Roselli also speaks to the American talent for reinvention. In America, you can create a new identity, build a new life, and become whoever you want to be. Roselli took this possibility to its extreme, creating an entirely fictional identity that became more real than his birth identity. The fact that he could not escape his past, that the FBI eventually uncovered his true identity, that his criminal history caught up with him, that he ended up in an oil drum, suggests there are limits to reinvention. You can transform yourself, but you cannot completely erase who you were. Roselli's death in 1976 closed many doors, but it opened others. Certain questions about his life will never be answered. Did he know anything important about Kennedy's assassination? Or were his hints just misdirection and self-promotion? What exactly was his role in the Hollywood extortion scheme? Was he a key planner or just a lieutenant following orders? How much money did he really make during his criminal career? And where did it all go? Did he have genuine friendships with people like Frank Sinatra and Harry Cohn? Or were all his relationships ultimately just about what they could do for each other? What did he really believe about America, patriotism, and his own legacy? Did he feel any regret for the violence he participated in and enabled over his long criminal career? These questions remain unanswered because Roselli was skilled at revealing just enough to be interesting while hiding the parts that really mattered. He controlled his story even when testifying under oath, even when facing death since his death. Johnny Roselli has appeared in countless books, documentaries, and films. He has been portrayed as everything from a sophisticated gentleman gangster to a ruthless killer to a patriotic American who served his country. The 1972 film The Godfather includes a character named Johnny Fontana, a singer who gets a movie role after mob pressure on a studio head. This is clearly based on Frank Sinatra's career and the mob's influence in Hollywood that Roselli helped create. While the famous horsehead scene is fiction, it reflects the reality of mob power in Hollywood that Roselli was part of. Oliver Stone's 1991 film JFK mentions the mob's plots with the CIA and Roselli's role in them. Though the film takes considerable liberties with the historical facts, numerous documentaries about the Kennedy assassination feature segments on Roselli and his testimony before the Church Committee. Books about organized crime almost always include chapters on Roselli. He has become a symbol for the mob's infiltration of legitimate society, their connections to political power, and the strange intersection of crime and patriotism during the Cold War. This cultural presence suggests that Roselli's story continues to interest people because it touches on fundamental American themes: ambition, reinvention, the corruption of institutions, the price of secrecy, and the consequences of knowing too much today. Nearly 50 years after Johnny Roselli's body was found in that oil drum, his story continues to fascinate. New books are written. Researchers dig through FBI files and CIA documents, looking for additional details about his life and death. Conspiracy theorists use his testimony and mysterious connections as evidence for their theories about Kennedy's assassination. The restaurant where he had his last meal is gone, replaced by new development. The casinos where he fixed problems and oversaw skimming operations have been torn down or changed by corporate owners. The Hollywood studios he once had influence over are now owned by large international companies. The CIA officers he worked with have died, taking their secrets with them. But the legend of Johnny Roselli, Handsome Johnny, the fixer who knew too much, lives on. His story touches something important about America in the 20th century: the intersection of crime and entertainment, of patriotism and practicality, of ambition and violence. He was born Filippo in an Italian village and died as Johnny Roselli in an oil drum floating in a Florida bay. Between those 2 points, he lived more lives than most people could imagine. He moved through American history like a shadow, always present but never quite visible, influencing events but never controlling them, gathering knowledge that ultimately proved deadly in the end. Johnny Roselli was exactly what his nickname suggested: a fixer. He fixed problems for the mob in Hollywood. He fixed situations in Las Vegas. He tried to fix the Cuba problem for the CIA. He tried to fix his own legal troubles through testimony and influence. But some problems cannot be fixed. Some knowledge is too dangerous. Some codes cannot be broken without consequences. And some men, no matter how clever or sophisticated, cannot talk their way out of an oil drum. So ends the story of Johnny Roselli. One man's journey from an Italian village to the depths of an American bay, with stops in Chicago, Hollywood, Las Vegas, and the secret meeting rooms where America's darkest operations were planned, if you have made it this far, you have journeyed through one of the most remarkable lives in American criminal history. You have seen the birth of organized crime during Prohibition, watched Hollywood's golden age through the eyes of a mob fixer, experienced the building of Las Vegas from desert sand to neon paradise, and glimpsed the shadowy world where intelligence agencies and criminal enterprises become hard to tell apart. What part of Roselli's story shocked you the most? Was it the boldness of the Hollywood extortion scheme? The strange reality of mobsters working with the CIA to kill Castro? The sad romance with Jean Harlow? The connection to President Kennedy through Judith Campbell? Or perhaps the brutal ending, 70 years of careful survival ending in an oil drum? The story of Johnny Roselli is the story of 20th century America itself, seen from the shadows where official history and criminal reality meet. He lived through and took part in some of the most changing decades in American history, from the chaos of Prohibition to the glamour of the Hollywood studio era, from the Cold War's desperate measures to the exposure of government secrets. Roselli was there, watching, participating, surviving, until he was not. His death in 1976 marked the end of an era, the old mob, the organization that had built Las Vegas and taken over Hollywood, that had worked with the CIA and influenced presidential elections, was dying. A new generation was taking over, less sophisticated, more violent, more likely to attract law enforcement attention. The golden age was over, and men like Roselli, smooth operators who could move between worlds, were relics of the past. But what a relic, what a life, what a story. If you made it this far, you are a true crime legend. Let me know in the comments what part of Roselli's story shocked you the most. Do not forget to subscribe for more deep dive gangster stories. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this journey through one man's incredible and tragic life. And remember, the next video is going to be even more amazing. I will see you there. Until then, sleep well and stay out of trouble.